Hi everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Zara and today I'm going to be doing part 2 in a new series that I've been doing, and that is called Dear Authors. This is the grimdark version, and I have changed this one slightly because I've also decided to create a section in this particular video called Dear Readers, because grimdark I think has a lot of misunderstandings surrounding it. I think a lot of people make assumptions about the genre just based on other booktubers and reviews. And I think there's a lot of negativity around the word grimdark. So I thought I would do the first half of this video speaking directly to authors, but then I also thought I would do the second part of this video speaking directly to readers as well. So I've kind of got 3 on each side. So with that in mind, let's jump into my video. So dear authors, please don't use violence for the sake of violence. Now there is a fine line in grimdark. One of the key characteristics of grimdark is the fact that the worlds tend to be very dark. They tend to be very gritty. They tend to not hold back from showing violence, from showing the harsh realities of everyday life. A really, really good example of that does it extraordinarily well is The Darkness That Comes Before by R. Scott Baker. A lot of people hate on that book because they say the violence is used unnecessarily so. I couldn't disagree more, because this is a world that is the darkest world that you could possibly think of. Probably. There is definitely a lot of philosophical exploration in Baker's books, but Baker is also one of the OG kind of grimdark, dark fantasy writers. And I think the thing about a lot of modern grimdark and darker fantasy is the fact that I think a lot of authors think they have to use violence just to show that it's a dark world. And I think there's other mechanisms that you can use to show that a world is dark, aside from violence, especially very graphic violence. I personally don't mind it because I've got a pretty high threshold for this stuff, but I think when it starts to detract from the story, that's when it starts to get a bit frustrating. I'll give you an example. Now, the second book in the Empire of the Vampire series, Empire of the Damned, which I read earlier on this year, I did a review of it, go check it out. There were some scenes in that book that I just feel like actually detracted from the overall story, and I felt like those scenes were put in just for shock value. Again, I do not mind violence in books. I really do not. It's something that I kind of come to expect in the types of books that I read. But I think there has to be a limit sometimes. I think it also has to make sense for the story. It has to add to the story. And I think sometimes when you add too many scenes like that, it actually ends up having the opposite effect. So please, if you're going to use violence, make sure it actually has a point. Even if the point being made is that there is a pointlessness to violence, right? That the violence that is being done to the people is pointless. Like, it doesn't need to be happening, and yet it's still happening. And so the violence in a way is pointless. And even if that is the point that you're trying to make, there is a way to do it that doesn't then put your own writing at risk of being pointless, if that makes sense. I've been seeing this more and more. There's a few books that I was planning to read, grimdark books that came out this year, that I ended up deciding not to because I saw commonalities in the reviews that there's just scenes in there for the sake of it to create kind of shock value. And while I think there sometimes is a place for that, I think doing it multiple times in the same book is a little bit excessive, in my opinion. The next one, please don't. Please don't. And this one is a very specific trope that I don't like in grimdark fantasy in particular, and that is continue to use the band goes on a mission trope. This is a very popular trope in fantasy, but it is a very, very popular trope in grimdark fantasy in particular. It's when a ragtag group of people who are all morally grey in their own ways come together. They're all against each other in some way as well, and yet they have to work together to solve a particular mission, to conduct a particular mission. One example is The Maleficent 7 by Cameron Johnston. I actually quite enjoyed that book. I thought it was fun. It was a really good palate cleanser, but I'm seeing more and more books like that book. Not to say that Cameron Johnston was the first person to do it. There are definitely people who've done that before Cameron Johnston did. But I'm seeing more and more books, grimdark books, coming out that have that exact same trope, and it's so unnecessary. It's like I'm seeing a lot of heist fantasy books at the moment. Like, I don't know why. We don't need loads of heist fantasy books because they're starting to become very predictable and they're starting to become quite repetitive. And I feel like that's what's happening in a very specific subset of grimdark fantasy at the moment. If you are planning to write a grimdark fantasy book, please don't do that trope. Please don't do that trope. Try something new. And don't do heist either. Try something new. It's just starting to get very tiring, in my opinion. And I think we need to move on and do more interesting stuff, personally. The next one and the final one for authors is please don't use swearing for the sake of it. Similar to the first one, I feel like one of the big characteristics of grimdark and dark fantasy is that characters swear all the time. Again, I think when you overuse something so much, it kind of loses its meaning. It kind of loses its impact. I think for me, the reason why I don't like it all the time, like on every single page, is that I think it just makes your characters sound really infantile, because it reminds me of, like, you know, when you were at school and teenagers first discovered swear words and they would just say them all the time. Like, that's what it reminds me of. Like, it just doesn't need to be happening, right? As particularly with a lot of grimdark books, you're following older characters. Like, we don't need to be swearing every single page, multiple times a page. Like, it detracts from the story. It makes it less enjoyable. I think unless that's the tone that you're going for, something that's a bit silly, which I could understand. If that's what you want to do, then go for it. But I think a lot of the times that's not actually the intent, and it comes across as a bit dumb and you just can't take the characters seriously. I think a really good balance is what we get in First Law, like a really good balance in First Law. Like, there is a bit of swearing in those books. I wouldn't say it's like a lot, but I think the balance is right. Like, I think it's enough that they're there and you can tell this is an adult fantasy book, but it's not too much that it makes you think the characters are a bit stupid because all they do is use swear words. The second part to this as well is also using them in the wrong places. Like, I think sometimes grimdark fantasy authors could use swear words like in pretty serious scenes, and sometimes that's intentional to make kind of light relief of the situation. It's one thing that I really like about grimdark is the ability to make light of an incredibly dark situation sometimes. Again, Abercrombie, Parker, these are authors that do that really well. But I think sometimes I've seen authors do it in a way where it's like a genuinely really serious scene. Somebody uses a swear word that's so out of place and it kind of takes you out of the scene. Like, it's very odd. It doesn't belong there. It doesn't need to be there. Just take it out. Take it out. I promise. It's not doing you any favours. So that's it for the Dear Author side. Now I'll move on to Dear Readers, and this is for people who maybe don't know much about grimdark, and this is just based on a lot of comments that I've seen from booktubers in the past on Goodreads, you know, just kind of on Twitter as well. Like, the whole discussion around grimdark has been a tale as old as time, to be honest. I just thought I'd kind of give my opinion on it. So, Dear Readers, please don't assume that grimdark glorifies violence. You know, whether it's assault, whether it's grape, I'm not going to say the word because I don't want to get demonetized, whether it's just, you know, war scenes, whatever it may be, battle scenes. I think that can happen. And going back to what I said as my first one, please don't use violence for the sake of violence to authors. That definitely can happen, don't get me wrong. But I do think that is more of a recent thing. I think that's more just authors trying to position them as grimdark because grimdark is the cool thing at the moment, which is great, but at the same time, the violence needs to have a point. And I think especially a lot of the older grimdark and a lot of the OG grimdark writers don't do that. Like, Abercrombie, great example. Daniel Abraham, to some extent, I would consider a grimdark author, definitely does that. Baker, definitely, in my opinion, does not use violence for the sake of violence. I'm just using very popular examples just to give a point of reference. And I think particularly a lot of women, female readers, assume that these books are glorifying, you know, sexual assault against women. And while that can be the case, I have found that in a lot of the grimdark that I've read, a lot of that stuff is happening to everyone, not just women. It's happening to the men as well. And that just goes to show how dark the world is. But I think it's important to kind of look at it in the broader context and not just against specific groups, if that makes sense. I definitely do think there can be issues with that, and I've definitely seen issues with that in fantasy books, for sure. And I'm also not discounting how people might feel. If they feel uncomfortable, that's totally fine. But I think in general, I think the grimdark gets a lot of bad rep for being unnecessarily violent. And I think you just have to remember that that is kind of like one of the conditions of the world. But as I said, to the author side, there's a balance that you have to keep in check too. So it's quite hard, I think, for authors to be able to keep that balance in track, but there are definitely plenty of authors who have done that. The next one, please don't assume every single character is evil, because that's not true. Again, one of the hallmarks of grimdark, and I will do a video on this, like what is my definition of grimdark, because everybody's definition of grimdark is very different. But my definition of grimdark is that all of the characters tend to be very morally grey, and by morally grey we mean that they are not necessarily good people, though they do have the capacity to do good acts, but they also have that same equal capacity to do bad acts and to do things that are bad. And that's often because our characters are put in pretty bad situations, and I actually think that makes them more relatable, because every single human being is flawed. You know, whether you're the Dalai Lama or whether you're the random person on the street, every single person is flawed, I promise you. It's just whether we try to improve, right? That I think differentiates truly bad people from good people. And I think one of the most common pieces of feedback that I get is I just don't want to read books about horrible people. I think it's a bit more nuanced than that. Like, I think there's a bit more maturity that we need to bring to this conversation about whether these characters are just straight up bad, because like human beings, characters can have nuance. Believe it or not. Just bear that in mind. Like, not every single character is going to be straight up bad or evil. Like, there's meant to be nuance, and that nuance is meant to be explored. So just be patient with it, take your time with it, and you might find that you might actually enjoy some of the characters. Next, and this is the final one, please don't assume that every female character is portrayed as weak or lacking depth. This one frustrates me the most. And I'm going to talk about a series that I mentioned earlier because I think I have to, and that is the Prince of Nothing trilogy and the Aspect Emperor quartet by R. Scott Baker. One of the most common pieces of negative feedback that I heard about that world is the fact that the women are portrayed as weak, and they're like, you know, third-class citizens, and they have no power. And a lot of people base that just on reading like the first book, and sometimes not even finishing the first book. And you have to remember, this is a 7-book series. It's a very broad world. And I think making an assumption about certain characters on one book in a 7-book world is just incredibly dense. Incredibly dense. There's one character that I'm going to mention, Esmenet. Esmenet is one of my favourite characters in that world and just in general. She's an incredibly well-written character. She has nuance to her. A lot of nuance to her. She's very vulnerable and she's incredibly strong. And in my opinion, she is one of, if not the strongest character in this entire world. And that's something that I came to learn as I progressed throughout the series. And I think a lot of people, when they hear about grimdark, they assume that the female characters are not strong. They are just kind of there as an object, sometimes a sexual object, to be at the pleasure of the male characters. And while that, yes, can sometimes be the case, I think the point is that even a character who is heavily sexualized can be incredibly compelling and complex. Esmenet at the start of the series is actually a prostitute. So the fact that she is where she is at the start and then where she ends up by the end of even the initial trilogy, oh my gosh, her arc is just absolutely incredible. And then by the end of the Aspect Emperor quartet, she's just even more like compelling and interesting. If you read the reviews of the first book alone, all of the negative reviews say that Esmenet is just objectified and blah blah blah, and that's just because people are very narrow-minded, in my opinion. And I think, like I said, I think basing that on one book is just incredibly silly and potentially highlights a lack of intelligence, to be completely honest. So I think, please, like, especially if I'm speaking particularly to female readers here, that if you are scared to read grimdark because of that, because of this common kind of criticism, please feel free to reach out to me and I will recommend you books that have incredibly strong female characters. Another one that I will give an example of is The Winter Road by Adrian Selby. This is one of my favourite grimdark fantasy books, one of my favourite fantasy books. Tia Anderson is just one of the most well-realised characters, and she's incredibly strong mentally, physically, but she's also very vulnerable, and she also has a lot of complicated thoughts about her role in society, but also just society as a whole and how that all kind of fits together. So there are books like that that exist, and there's a few more that I have. I'm potentially happy to do a video on this if that's of interest, but please don't just assume that grimdark means women are treated badly, because I just don't think that's fair. I don't think that's the case. I think that definitely can be the case, but I don't think, especially for a lot of the, you know, original older grimdark fantasy, that is the case. Like, I think there's some incredibly well realized female characters. I think you should, you know, give grimdark a chance to show you that women do have a place in these worlds and can be incredibly compelling. And then the last thing I will say just to dear readers, please do make sure that you read what you enjoy, and please do read what makes you happy, because I do agree and I do think that grimdark is not a lot for a lot of people. I think a lot of people read fantasy to escape from reality, and I think grimdark can hit the nose on the head a little bit too much sometimes. I read a grimdark fantasy book a few months back and it was too close to home, you know, some of the images that it conjured up in my mind, and I think that can definitely be off-putting for a lot of people. And I think you should factor that into your decision to read grimdark. I think if you're not in the right headspace for that, don't read it. Like, don't give yourself that headache, and just read what you enjoy and read what makes you happy, because it's not for everybody, and that's okay. So let me know down below if there's anything that you don't want to see authors doing, or that you don't want to see readers saying about grimdark fantasy. I know a lot of you who watch my channel love grimdark and dark fantasy. I've kind of coupled the two together because I think there is an interesting delineation to be made between them, but I don't necessarily think this is the video to make that delineation. But I will be doing a video, I think, coming soon, maybe in the next couple of weeks, about what kind of my understanding of grimdark is. I might even potentially kind of look at the history of grimdark and how it's evolved from like the Warhammer days. I don't know, we'll see. But if there's anything you'd particularly like me to cover, let me know down below and I will definitely add it to the list. So there we have it. I hope you enjoyed this one. I think my next one might be on heist fantasy books. I'm not sure. If there's one that you are particularly interested in me doing for this Authors Please Don't series, let me know down below and I'll definitely add it to the backlist. This one I just wanted to add in the reader element because I think there's a lot of reader biases that we get towards this genre that I think needs to be called out. So thanks for watching my video. If you did like it, please do give it a thumbs up and I will see you in my next one. Thanks for watching, folks. Stay safe. As always, take care and I'll see you soon.